Let's talk about this deal, and particularly since you're from Wisconsin, let's talk about the Canadian part of it. As I understand it, Chrystia Freeland, the foreign minister from Canada, is in Washington just today negotiating this. How important is it that we have Canada in with Mexico?
Well, it's extremely important. I think it's important for Mexico. Wisconsin has a trade surplus with both Canada and Mexico. Mexico is our largest market for Wisconsin cheese. So I was glad that the administration has come to terms with Mexico on a trade deal. I hope that Canada can also come to an agreement, because we really do want that North American market. And I was very pleased that we didn't have the 5-year sunset. I think this administration has done a great job. We stopped punishing success. We stopped adding to the regulatory burden, actually reduced a little bit, have a more competitive tax code. That brought certainty and stability to the economy, which is why we saw now the stock market up 42% since this president took off or was elected. That's important. The whole trade war injects uncertainty. A 5-year sunset would have solidified that uncertainty. So I'm really glad that the sunset was not part of that deal.
So from what you hear in Washington, both from the administration but also from the diplomatic corps, is it realistic to expect Canada to come to terms just in 4 short days? Because what they've said is they need it by Friday. At the same time, in fairness, they say Canada's been kept up to speed on at least some of the negotiations with Mexico already.
Well, it's obviously a pretty short time period. I wish this agreement would have been made months ago, because, again, we've just had this uncertainty hanging over our economy, and you can see how the stock market just stalled and how the stock market took off once this deal was done. So I hope the administration's paying attention to that. I want to see Canada part of this. I think it's very important just in terms of being able to pass it through Congress. I don't understand all the hoops we're going to have to go through, but I know if it's just a bilateral agreement, that's going to be far more challenging than a revised NAFTA.
So if you do get a revised NAFTA and you get Canada in it, what's the fastest that could take effect? I mean, is it realistic to get something done before Mr. Obrador comes in as the new president of Mexico?
Well, I think that would be the goal, but it's incredibly difficult to predict what all happens here in Congress. I'm not a real fan of the functionality of this place. So I'm not going to predict anything, but from my standpoint, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that this deal is concluded and a good deal is concluded, and that we can move forward. Because we really do need to conclude NAFTA, trade negotiations with Europe, so that a united front of the rest of the trading world really goes to China and demands that they follow the rules, they stop stealing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of theft of our industrial and military secrets. It's going to take a united front of the rest of the trading world to really make sure that China behaves.
Well, I want to come back to China in just a second, but before we leave the NAFTA or whatever is left of NAFTA, how important is dairy to the people of Wisconsin? Because that seems to be an issue in Canada we really didn't have with Mexico.
It's very important, but the fact of the matter is the U.S. exports double the quantity of dairy to Canada than what it imports. So we basically have a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of dairy. And truthfully, where we had a problem with some ultra-fine milk, the Canadian ambassador called up a Canadian processor who had a plant in Wisconsin and asked that plant, and they did take some of that production from some of those dairy farmers that were affected. So I've personally had a fair amount of cooperation with Canada as it relates to dairy in Wisconsin.
So, Senator, you just said that it makes sense to you, as I understand it, to paraphrase, that we get together with Canada and Mexico and maybe the EU and then really turn to address the issues with China that everyone, I think, apart from the Chinese, agree are real substantial issues. Does it make sense to you that we're not talking to the Chinese yet? Does it make sense that we're going to wait till we get all that done before we even start talking?
Well, I think we probably are at a lower level talking to the Chinese, but they do need to understand that this is a real problem for them. When I was over in China around Easter time, the Chinese officials I talked to said they don't want a trade surplus. Well, fine. Let's figure out how to make sure that we have fair and full reciprocity in terms of trade, and in particular, stop stealing our industrial and military secrets. I mean, from my standpoint, that is where they have the biggest problem, is just that theft of intellectual property worth hundreds of billions of dollars per year, and that has to stop.
And finally, Senator, I want to turn really to a question about social media. President Trump tweeted out this morning, and I don't expect that you will have read all of President Trump's tweets. There are quite a few of them. But it was really on the question of whether some of the social media outlets are really skewed against conservatives. I'll read it to you just in fairness. It says, Google search results for Trump news shows only the viewing reporting of fake news media. In other words, they have it rigged for me and others so that almost all stories and news is bad. Fake CNN is prominent. Republican and conservative fair media stuff is shut out. And then it goes on in that ilk. Is that your experience? Because you're on the receiving end of this. Do you have the perception that places like Google, like Facebook, have a skew against conservatives?
Well, I know the media definitely has a leftward bias, and certainly Silicon Valley has a leftward bias as well. I think it's a legitimate concern. These companies, Facebook, Google, are delivering news to a large percentage of the American population, and so we never allowed, for example, one single owner in a smaller community to have the newspaper, the radio station, the TV station, because we didn't want that concentration of power delivering information. Now we have these massive, multi-billion-dollar companies that are making all the decisions in terms of what Americans see in terms of news. So from my standpoint, it is a very legitimate issue, a very legitimate concern on all sides of the political spectrum. The tides can turn, but we really do need to understand what's happening in terms of social media and the power that they have in terms of what Americans see when it comes to political discourse.
In closing, to add on a sad note, you lost a colleague, Senator John McCain, on Saturday. And the nation really mourns. Certainly Washington, D.C. is in mourning. What is the most fitting tribute to this man? I mean, it's one thing when we have a service, which we will have, we have a burial, but what should be left of John McCain? Should we rename the Russell Office Building, or should we be addressing one or more of the substantive issues that he fought so valiantly for up on Capitol Hill?
I will say renaming the Russell Office Building was an idea from Chuck Schumer that I actually agree with, but there may be other ways as well. So I'm open to any way of honoring John McCain, but I think the best thing we can do is follow his example. Understand the patriotism that this man represented. You're working tirelessly for a cause greater than himself. Understanding how important our relationships were and our alliances were within NATO and EU, and promoting America's values and principles throughout the world. He was a tireless advocate for that. He was a national hero, not only in America, but I traveled with him over into Europe. He was a national hero to those people that were trying to establish democracy, shed themselves of the legacy of the Soviet Union, and fighting for their own individual liberty and freedom. To me, that really is the legacy of John McCain.